This was true not only for the Black Panther Party, but for other liberal and radical elements in West Coast politics. And that's one of the things I'll be talking about, is that it's not only true of the radical organizations, but some of these student groups contained electoral politicians who would later become important, and that they share this common history and access to public education, especially the community colleges, but also state and UC level. Elsewhere, I've summarized my research by explaining, quote, "It is a little known fact that the Black Panther Party started with a study group," end quote. On the West Coast, campus organizing in the early 60s provided a crucial link to Black power organizations that formed after Watts. So you have a history of early continuity from the early 60s of the kind that Professor Joseph talks about in his paper. Black adolescents and young adults utilized access to higher education, especially at the state and community college level, to form study groups and ultimately political organizations that challenged state repression and neglect suffered by California's migrant communities. The intellectual and political awakening engendered by these early student groups culminated in the emergence of revolutionary nationalist ideology and a new generation of youth activists. Although many of these groups did not become visible until the late 60s, their foundations were laid nearly a decade before. Through using extensive oral history with members not only of the Panthers, but the groups that preceded them, the history I have resurrected stems as much from opportunity and resource as poverty and exclusion. By excavating the prehistory of the Black Panther Party in an earlier student movement on Bay Area urban campuses, I break with an older historiography that defines Black power as a tragic response to liberalism's failures. This distinction is important not only in terms of research, but also the philosophical and theoretical underpinnings of the Black Panther Party and the larger Black power movement. I argue that exclusion, inequality, and state neglect are insufficient to explain the power and influence of Bay Area Black power and Black studies movements. As Doug McAdams has shown in his multiple iterations of the political process model, resources were essential to successful popular mobilizations for social change. And in California, I think the central one was public education, this golden era. It is a matter of historical contingency. Both the UC Berkeley and Merritt College were located in such close physical proximity to large Black population settlements, and that young migrants came of age at precisely the time the state was extending the reach and funding of higher education under the California Master Plan. However, it's a tribute to human creativity how Black youth transformed attempts at social engineering and utilized these institutions to challenge the political and social barriers that migrant families faced. In the words of one of my interview subjects, Ernest Allen, quote, "The fact that Merritt College was located right in the middle of a community was a historical accident, but what people made of it was something else." One of the keys to understanding the developments of the late 60s is excavating the history of organizations like the Afro-American Association that had left behind few archival records. As I embarked on my own study of Bay Area radicalism, it quickly became clear to me that nearly all of the young radicals who ultimately became visible in the late 60s had been initiated into radical politics through participating in Black student groups in the early 60s. Starting in 1961, UC Berkeley students founded the Afro-American Association, California's first indigenous Black nationalist group. Prompted by the murder of Patrice Lumumba and the demonstrations at the United Nations protesting US involvement, Black students came together and formed an early study group they later called the Afro-American Association. So the campus is also a place where you see the convergence between the international and the local. So through campus newspapers and campus networks, people begin to make these very concrete connections between the local struggles they face and international events. What is striking about the association's membership was the wide-ranging nature of the participants, who included both founders of the Panther Party, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, but also Ronald Everett, later Milana Karenga, founder of the US organization in '65, and future Black Mayor Elihu Harris as a high school student, and Congressman Ronald Dellums never formally joins the association, but he remains affiliated with it. This early nationalist study group included both Black radicals that would bitterly oppose each other in the late 1960s and electoral politicians who retained lifelong ties to other members. By studying this early movement of Black consciousness, it shows that connections between Black electoral and radical politics that would not become fully visible I would argue until the election of Ron Dellums in 1970 and the Black Panthers municipal campaign were forged much earlier. And one of the places you see the continuing influence of the Afro-American Association is that the Panthers run a campaign for mayor and for city council in 1973. And Ron Dellums' advisor helps with their campaign as a kind of intermediary between the Panthers and Black electoral politicians. And he was one of the founders of the Afro-American Association. So that circle of people remains important in 1973. I might also add as an aside, I was in Oakland a couple years ago after Dellums' election, and it was quite remarkable how still there was a reunion of the Afro-American Association, and still, even as mayor of Oakland today, many of his advisors date from that period. So these are really enduring social networks that remain a force even now. So the Afro-American Association is just one example of an organization whose history hasn't been written, and that has to do with the question of sources. So I thought that might be something that we can talk about. It was a history that I had to reconstruct almost entirely through oral history, and doing oral history for years and years and years, trying to reconstruct these far-flung networks because people have moved all over the world. So the question of sources, I think, is essential to doing this work of historical recovery, as well as the shift in epistem. In conclusion, Professor Joseph's historiographical frame will play an important role in the work of future scholarship in recovering the lost and hidden history of Black radicalism and Black power organizing. As he explains, much of this work still remains largely unwritten.